Good afternoon, everybody. A few people might still be joining in, so you might hear some dings in the background. But I'm going to go ahead and get started here. If you're joining for the first time, just a quick introduction. I'm Tony Dubio. I work for Red Hat. I'm a product solutions architect focused on Ansible, and my background is networking. So primarily, my focus is network automation using Ansible. And today we're going to look at leveraging some of the newer validated content to make it really easy to create backups and to restore configurations that will allow us to make it a lot easier to manage our environments and to sort of make that transition to a as a code type of paradigm, so we can version control our labs and perhaps rebuild environments for production and things of that nature. So let me go ahead and I'm going to switch over to a couple of slides real quick. But just to let you know, if you want to, you're able to unmute yourself. So if you have a question, I may not notice it in the chat. I'll keep that open just in case I do. But sometimes when I'm on slides and stuff, I don't see the screen. So just feel free, if you need to ask a question, feel free to just unmute yourself. And we should have plenty of time to get through this material and address any questions and things like that. So without further ado, today we're going to look at validated content again, so we can change or restore our network configs. And these are some of the use cases that I feel that this validated content does a really good job and makes it easy to accomplish these things. One of those is, and this is something I guess like from my own myopic view of things, I'm always creating these labs, and depending on where I run them and the types of network devices that I'm using, oftentimes they're virtualized, and I may need to change around topologies or configs and go back in time to to rev back to like a change that I made a while ago. And sometimes this is not just so much testing the devices like in an environment, but just as I'm creating content. And content could be playbooks or roles or templates or maybe building like my own collections and things of that nature. I like being able to easily go back to different topologies. So that's kind of like the main reason why I use this particular validated content that I refer to. And we'll take a look at where this content is. And if you're new to validated content, I'll give you a little bit of a quick level set on that. Another one is more operational. So if you're in an environment where there's a lot of changes happening, and they typically lend themselves to mistakes, then you may or may not have the luxury of doing a lot of troubleshooting in production. So it's pretty useful to be able to easily take your production configurations and kind of save them as a single source of truth and apply them to other environments in your lab. So that way, if you have an issue in production, you may be able to recreate it in a lab, and that will allow you to iterate through a bunch of different changes as you're trying to figure out, what the root cause is. And because it's a lab, you may also introduce more automation around troubleshooting. So perhaps you have some playbooks that run several show commands and then capture those responses as standard output that you parse through, or in some cases, depending on the type of device, you have structured data that you're looking at and parsing through. It's very useful to be able to do that in an environment where you're not disrupting things further. So it's a good use case for that. And then, as we all deal with, is in these downtime windows, there's going to be failures sometimes. So being able to restore production environments because of mistakes and restore them as quickly as possible, then there's several different techniques that you can use with Ansible. And this one is more around like, we're dealing with the entire configuration in terms of like the backups and the restores. But you can also go further than that by using resource modules. And if you watched the scoped session that I had a while ago on scope configurations with Ansible, that one was using a different set of validated content where it was managing the resource modules on your behalf. And the reason why I bring up resource modules is because they're used for scope configurations, and they're very useful because they have state options. So when you make a configuration change, the default is merged, and that's just like what you're typically used to with Ansible, with it being idempotent, where Ansible can see state once connected to the device to see if the configuration already exists, its presence or absent. Merge allows you, in the event that the configuration is absent, to be able to merge it with existing configurations. So that one's useful from the standpoint of being safer to deal with, as opposed to some of the other ones that, depending on the scenario, you may need to take further care. So some of those are replaced. So replace will look to see if the configuration exists, and if it doesn't, then it will add that configuration. So it's, in some ways, it's a lot like merged, but where it differs is that replaced, if it sees configs in the running device that are not in your configurations for Ansible. So one aspect of Ansible is that it is infrastructure as code, or in this case, network as code. So typically we have a single source of truth, which normally and recommended is like a Git repository. So those are the configurations that typically you're comparing as the intended config versus what's running on the device. And then when you have those diffs, then it's either a decision, from a policy standpoint, do you overwrite configs that are not a part of your single source of truth, that someone perhaps came in and added them out of band, outside of the automation, or do you need to ingest those configurations and update your single source of truth? So that other validated content is called the network.base, and then there's several permutations of that, like for network.bgp, network.ospf, network.acl, network.interfaces that are specific, more scoped to a specific type of configuration. But within all that, they also map to the state of deleted. So that's where the scope part is important, because you can actually remove just a single configuration that you pushed from a resource module, or one that is different from what it should be, in terms of comparing your single source of truth versus what is actually running in that device. And then based off your policy, you can just remove that one config. So that way the blast radius is smaller in terms of disruption. So it's just a single config. So it's not like when you do replace the entire config, it's okay normally, like in a lab environment that we're talking about, but in production, you may not want to do that in its entirety, because you could have like routing protocols that need to reconverge states of different things, like your ARP tables and CAM tables and TCAM tables and the like. So that's where a more targeted approach usually makes sense. And then the last piece that we kind of talked about just generically is this whole thing around configuration drift. So really all that is that whatever your intended configuration is, I'm saying that, for my intents and purposes of these labs, it's normally some YAML files that would exist in like host vars, and in some cases in group vars. I would determine my baseline configs and have those saved there, and then that's my intended configurations that we would compare against devices. But it doesn't have to be host vars. It could actually be like something else, like a system that specializes in single source of truth. So that could be like a netbox, or an ITSM. So if you have a CMDB, you could check against that. So if the configuration, Ansible would use the collection or REST API, to determine what a config element is on one of those systems, and then compare that to what the configuration as it exists, in its current state on a device. And then again, make a determination: do we want to keep do we want to keep what we had as single source of truth, or do we want to update that with the change that was made on the device? And I think that happens a lot, just due to troubleshooting, and even if you have an automation first approach, there's going to be those scenarios where because of the impact of the downtime and whatever the outage is, then it's necessary to use your out of band and command line and things of that nature to remediate some of these issues. So that's kind of the premise. This is what I have. I don't have like a whole lot of things for us to go through, but just a couple examples that hopefully articulate, how we can use Ansible to accomplish some of these things. So what what I want to do, actually, we're not doing this part here, the STIG check. Let me remove that one. That's more of a compliance type of thing. We're going to do everything else though. So we want to see what backups look like in terms of using a Git repository and checking them into their own branch. And we also want to, what I'm saying is onboarding a new network topology is commensurate with, just changing like a lab topology around, which is something that happens a lot. So in this particular slide, let me make it larger again so it's easier for you to view on your side. And it actually gets in the way of the text. Sorry, this slide's kind of messed up, but this is like the current state where there's only 4 routers in here. Router 1 is a Cisco, so it's a Catalyst 8000V. Then I have 2 Arista routers, router 2 and router 4, and then router 3 is a Juniper router, and they're all virtual routers. We're going to change the topology around so they're connected a little bit differently, but I'm also removing like a routing protocol, so BGP is not utilized in the second topology. It's just OSPF. And then this line here is just indicating that there's an IPSLA configured with a tracker. So it has no real bearing on what we're demonstrating today other than it's different, right? So this is just a different scenario altogether. And my configs need to change, not just how they're connected, but also how the routing protocols are set up, and other aspects of the configuration need to change. And I can also easily change them back. And we're going to do this as code because I'll be able to name the branch, and we can always roll back or roll forward forward to what we had and vice versa. So it works in reverse. So we have the Git repository, and then we can restore from that. So we'll do some validation just to make sure that our configs are changing and things like that too on the actual device. So we'll SSH into the router too, just to make sure that what we think we're seeing in Ansible is actually what has been configured and is the current state on the routers as we go through. So okay, so we're done on the slide side of things. So let me just go back to here. Unless anyone, let me make sure no one has anything in the chat or anything. Okay, so it looks like we're okay from that standpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up one of my Ansible lab environments, and I just need to log in. If you're seeing this for the first time, this is the Ansible automation platform, but the component that we're logging into is the controller, which used to be called Tower, and now it's the Ansible controller, or the automation controller, which is just one component of the Ansible automation platform. And I gotta find my password real quick. All right, and then I'll just go to here's where normally the landing page is. So this is the main dashboard that just keeps track of any automation that you run is tracked by a job, and it has a job number, which is useful because it gives us, the status of if a job were to pass or fail and how long it took to run the job. So we can use that over time to compare performance in our automation, because as we tweak things, we'll be able to automate better in terms of playbook creation and things of tuning in that nature, but also just the way that we connected multiple devices at the same time and different techniques that we use. You should improve performance as you learn more about Ansible. So you can kind of track that from this. And you can also replay jobs. So you can go back to these artifacts and rerun them. So it already has any facts that you created or variable, all that stuff is there in cache. So you can rerun them as they were. So that's the main point of this landing screen. And then where we're going to spend most of our time is in templates. So there's 2 types of templates. There's a job template, and a job template manages a playbook. And then there's a workflow template. And a workflow template manages orchestration. So you're drawing out, different stages of automation, and that could be multiple playbooks or job templates, or you could be stitching together multiple workflows. And there's other aspects of a workflow and capabilities that you can do, like syncing your inventory again, pulling down a project. If anything changed in like your Git repo, you can update that like as part of the workflow. And there's approval nodes. So approvals are where everything stops in the workflow into either a system for like change management, through the REST API makes the approval that way. Through a collection, like we have collections for like ServiceNow and other systems that can kind of front end Ansible, or you can simply just access, if you have an account that has roles-based access as an approver, you can go and you can approve the approval node to move forward in a workflow. So we'll see some of that in action as well. I'm logged in as admin, so I'm able to do everything. But if I were to log in as a different user, then we could restrict what we have access to. So that's over here with the access configurations. So we're not really focused on that today, but just wanted you to know that you do have the capability to create different users that have different roles and add them to teams and add them to organizations like at the highest level of separation and how you want to organize and allow access, to the automation in the controller. Okay, so again, I wanted to kind of give you a backdrop of what we're going to use. So one of the ones is this network.backup. So this particular validated content, and what validated content really is at the end of the day is its roles. So if you're familiar with roles, and you may have, from a content development standpoint, you may have created your own roles in the past. And normally that is a consequence of, learning how to create playbooks. And once they work and function, other people want to share your playbooks, right? And utilize your playbooks. So instead of just handing out playbooks, normally people will create roles. And roles is a very specific file structure. So that way we can take a playbook and all of the like requirements that a playbook typically needs. We want to start to dissect them and to variabilize them and make them easy for someone else to use, with the intent that the role maps to a very specific use case. So the roles here, obviously are only focused on creating backups, right? So within a role, you may have multiple things that are going on. So this role is called run. And then you can see that it has some tasks, which all roles do, right? So we've got this main.yaml, but this is very high level. So this is really calling tasks that are included. And if you're not familiar with building roles, usually you can package what a role does kind of in like the task itself, but sometimes you need to make it more modular. So this one is doing a lot. And that's kind of the point of the validated content, is it's sort of like a role that's like kind of the intelligent role that manages other roles or includes other tasks, but it orchestrates it for you such that it's very easy for you to consume. Because otherwise you'd have to create a role or a bunch of playbooks, turn them into roles, and then start to figure out how you want to orchestrate these roles together to accomplish the use case. So these tasks, collectively do the thing, but you want them to be very specific, very cohesive to what the task is doing. So that's why they, further include tasks and things like that. So if we go back to run, you see all these includes. So there's tons of these in here that are doing different things. So one of the ones that catches my eye is the files, because what we're doing is when we're backing up configurations from network devices, by default, it creates a backup folder in your project. So the project is where you're working from with Ansible, but then we can set a path. So a backup path to override that, but we really only can have access to where Ansible can connect to. So one of the things that confuses people with Ansible is that when you install Ansible Core Engine, On your global operating system, or if you build like a virtual environment, then it has access to the project folder, where you're running your playbooks, and it also can point to a playbook underscore dir for the playbook directory, and it can get to those just fine. But when we run these inside of the Ansible automation controller or in the Ansible navigator, we're running them on a container that's called the execution environment. So effectively, everything's running inside that container. So when we need access to files outside of that, then we have to do further manipulation in some cases, and also copy files and things of that nature, or publish them to like a Git repository. So that's what's happening here, is that my backups are going to a Git repository. So there's some level of needing to manipulate the files because I need to write those files to the repository. So that's one aspect. But then there's also like the Ansible.scm module is used. So that way we can publish them and push them to a repo. So it's not just roles and including other tasks, or including or importing other roles. It's also dependencies on other collections that have modules. So when we talk about collections or certified content, and also the community content, those are typically collections that have modules and plugins and things that we use, so that way we can use them based off of what we want to automate. So if we're automating a Cisco router, then we need the collection, either the community one or the one that is certified with Red Hat um, from Cisco, and based off of what iOS it is. So if it's iOS XE, it's Cisco.iOS collection. If it's the XR, it's Cisco.iOS XR. And then there's also the Nexus OS. Depending on the type of device, we need to have that collection, so that way we call the correct modules. The roles use those modules. So the roles are like how we're going to automate. So a role, again, is really just a playbook, or this is like a fancy, grouping of playbooks into roles, and then going beyond that to roles that manage other roles and include other tasks, but also have dependencies on collections. So there's a lot there, but the good news is that when you use the validated content, it has a dependency that will also install like other collections and things that are needed, that you package ultimately into your execution environment. So that's where everything lives, in one place. And the good news is when you work with this like locally with Navigator using the EE, it's the same EEs, the same containers with all these dependencies wrapped together that you use from the automation controller. So once, it's kind of a skill set to learn and a little bit hard to wrap your head around if you're new to that. But once you get past that, it's very nice, because it makes it very easy to work with other people and to have access to what you need based off of versions as well. So you may have like older collections, and then you can version control your EEs that have different collections that you need. Maybe you have some legacy devices, that kind of stuff. And all of that can be stored in the private automation hub, which is another component. So we're not actually touching that today. We're just talking about the controller. But the private automation hub would be just another VM or another bare metal, or another installing it on Kubernetes or OpenShift with the operator. It'll just be another component that you bring up, and all this stuff would live there, and then you pull it down as you need it when you run the automation. So again, here's just some examples. So when you click in here, you'll see that this is a group of tasks that are just specific to creating the file path and creating a directory, those types of things. Just a couple other examples, and then we'll get more into the meat of what's going on. Here's the backup one. So in this one here, you can see that we're using this right here as a condition. So if you set your data store as source control module, then you need to have, obviously that's what you're using, is that Ansible.scm module. But then you could also, if you're not, it's just locally saving it to like a folder, and then it would set up that structure. So let's another good one. Network path retrieve. Yeah, a lot of these are just using other variables that you create in the other task. But the good news is that you really don't have to understand this too much because once you define the required variables, all this stuff is kind of happening behind the scenes. So that's the backup. And then the restore is kind of the same thing. You go into the roles and you've got like the main one here for run. And then it's including the other ones. So you go back to includes. And then you have different ones depending on what you're doing. Right. So a lot of these, because we're restoring a file, they're using SCP, right? So see how the protocol here is SCP, and it's a part of the Ansible.NET Common netput module. So the other option is SFTP. So it just depends on your device, whichever one it supports, and that's how it can push the configs back into the device. Um, if you want to use this like outside of the validated content, and sometimes I do that where I do my own thing, right? So I'm just calling resource modules directly in a playbook or a role that I create. I've used this, this netput module before, and it's useful for things like upgrading devices. In this case, we're updating the config, right, and overriding it. But it's good for upgrades and really any scenario where you need to SCP something to a device. So you can call this directly. It's just that this is being orchestrated, for us kind of under the hood. So that's kind of the big thing is file manipulation, the backups themselves. In this case, like for Cisco, it would be cisco.ios.ios_config, and then there's a backup parameter. And the same thing with Arista and Juniper and other vendors would be similar. All of that's happening again for us. So mine is a multi-vendor lab setup, so I don't have to think about that because all of those parameters are being set for me because of my inventory. Once we have the inventory and it says, okay, here's the OSs that we're using and the connection types, then this particular role is smart enough to use the correct modules depending on which vendor we're talking about. So again, a lot of this, we might come back to this, but if this is the link if you want to check them out. So here's the restore one. Here's I'll drop the backup one because it's pretty much in the same spot. But you can look at these, if you'd like. If you wanted to use them though, you have to turn them into a collection. So that's kind of like a skill set that you would need to have. So you can check those out just to get an idea of the file structure and all those things that are in that collection. So what I mean by like turning it into like your own collection would be if you clone that down, you can run the Ansible-Galaxy collection init, and it'll wrap it into a tar file. And then you can take that tar file, and that's one of the methods of creating an execution environment. So that's like a whole nother set of skill sets that we don't have time to talk about today. But there are some decent labs that get into that. So I'll either drop a link here before we conclude, or I make these videos available afterwards on my YouTube channel. So it's Ansible4Networking on YouTube, and I'll provide the links. So there'll be a link to what we're talking about. We only have a couple of slides today, but I'll even put that out there. But I always add them there, and I also add them if you found this from the Meetup group. If you go back to the event, I always go into the comments and put the links to like the video and then anything like this where there's something else, like a link to something that we talked about, and I'll add it there as well. But there are some good labs that show you how to create execution environments. So again, we're not going to do that today, but that's something that you're going to want to know, especially as you're using Ansible and wanting to build your own content and also making your own collections. All right, so having said all that, and that was just kind of to give you a little bit of a background, let's go ahead and see some of this in action. So to find this, I named everything with a git. So here's the backups. This git intent is doing like a configuration drift check, and then restore would actually use that netput and push the config back to the device and overwrite the configuration. So we'll go ahead and we'll run this one first. So we can name this whatever we want. And what I'm naming again is this is a branch, right? So when we create this, we'll be able to go into my Git T, which is sort of like a GitHub or a GitLab. It's just a source control, based off of Git, but it's free. So in this lab environment, we can use that to interact with. So we'll check it there and validate that we actually have a backup. So we're just naming the branch. So today is like May 30th. It's going to add a timestamp anyway, but just something so that we can see it easily. And then which groups? So these groups are referring to groups in my inventory. And I'll probably just take a quick view of that just to give you, again, another level set around what we have for a backdrop. So I have Cisco, I mentioned was just the one router, two Arista, one Juniper. Right, so we'll go ahead and make a backup of all of those. And you'll notice in the output, a lot of those tasks that we took a quick look at, you'll see those as they're included. It's gathering facts first from the devices. Then it retrieves the repository. So it's going to my Git T to pull that down, and it's creating a new branch from that. So if you're not familiar with like GitOps types of stuff, you normally don't work in your main branch. Ultimately, you want to merge into it or do a pull request into your main. But normally we're working in branches, and these branches are interesting because then we can name them, and it's a really easy way to store our backups so we can rebuild them, at a certain point in time. So one of the things I use here is this filter because I only care about the things that changed for the most part. So we can see all the things that changed. So the first part was pulling down the repo from Git T over here to my local EE. So that's the execution environment that has all of my collections of modules and also the validated content of roles that we're using for this. And one of them being the backup or network.backup. And then run is the name of the role. So it went ahead and it created a backup path for each one of these. And when you click on them, you can see the JSON output of what it did. So it created this path. So I should have all of my files that we backed up should be included in that branch here in network underscore backup underscore files. The main branch does not have any backups, right? Because we're always working from a new branch. And then we're always going back to that branch when we want to restore it. So my main branch does not have, shouldn't have any backups in it. And then publishing the changes is when we're pushing back, right? So we're pushing back to this network demos repo. And these are the Git commands, but we didn't have to actually interact with any of these commands. We did need to populate some variables and create a credential for this to work. So that was already done prior. So where that was coming from is over here. So in Ansible Automation Controller, you can set credentials here locally, or you can extend it to third-party systems. So if you have a CyberArk or a HashiCorp Vault or something like that, you can use those, or you can just create them locally and they're encrypted, or you can use Ansible Vault and create a password for it as part of opening that credential. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it, but the intent is that everything's always encrypted. So I have this Git T credential, and if I go in to edit it, we can kind of see how it's set up. And it's looking for a username and a password. And this may not be I can't remember if I set this up. This might be a token, but I just called it password, but it might actually be a password. Git T allows you to do either way. If you're using GitHub or GitLab in the current state, you have to use tokens. So you'll create like a personal access token, or you'll create a token for like the project you create, in that repo, and then you would use that instead. And then you have like the email as part of the parameter when you're, syncing your local repo, which in this case is running on an EE with the remote repo, which is this Git T over here. So And we'll go back to get T here in a second. So you have to have the credential, and then what else I want to show you from the, go back to the job. Yeah, so we were at the publish, and then we did some additional things. So we published back to the repo, but then we also wanted to create, using what we call controller as code, I wanted to create 2 new job templates. So remember, in Ansible controller, a job template is how you manage a playbook. So effectively, I have 2 other playbooks that I want to use, and I'm creating a job template from a playbook. And the reason why I call that controller as code is because I don't have to configure the automation controller from the GUI. I can actually run playbooks, and through that collection, a controller collection, or from the REST API, you can configure everything in the controller as if it were the GUI. It's feature parity for everything you can do from the GUI. You can do from the REST API or the module using the REST API under the hood. So I wanted to build 2 new job templates. One is called intent, and one is called restore. And even if they were already there, which I think these were already there, it's just going to update them. And what I'm updating them with is what we called that backup. So every time I create a new backup, I want to update that job template so that way it'll have a drop down. And the drop down is a part of a survey so that we can select the backup that we want. So every time we create a new backup, we also want to update these guys so that they have those options in their self-service survey. So that's the reason why these are here. And a lot of this will make more sense when we actually look at it. So it's probably easier to look at it from here. So I'm actually interacting with this repo, but this is like the repo that I cloned into this thing. So if I look at it from here, it's probably a little bit easier for you guys to see. So go back to the main directory. Well, I was actually in the main directory. And we want the one for Git. Backups Git. All right, so these are all the files here. So the one that we're doing at the moment was the backups. Right, so just normal playbook stuff, right? So I want to be able to interact with Cisco, Arista, and Juniper. And then local host is for when I'm talking to the Git repository. So I have all of these. And then, in my play, so I have to, this is, a requirement. So to point to the groups that I want to communicate with. You could also use commas, or you can list them out like this in YAML. And then moving down to the task, this is the module called ansible.scm.get retrieve. This is the same thing as doing like a git clone. So it'll pull down the branch. But for this branch, I'm creating a new branch. So if I don't give it a name, the default is to just give it the name of the playbook and then add a timestamp to it. So we gave it a name, but it also will add the timestamp by default, but it'll put that behind whatever we name it. And then duplicate detection, no. You just set that. Otherwise, it'll complain that you may, if you already used that branch name, you can't do it again. But we want to be able to call the same branch because when I go to the restore, I want to point to a specific branch. So I always keep the duplicate detection, no, in case that's what we're trying to do, like pull down one we've already created. Otherwise, it's going to keep creating a new one, a new branch every time you run this. And then we register it into memory. So whenever you register, you create variables, and we're naming that dictionary and memory repository. So we can point to repository if needed to get access to that data. So the next part of this is actually running the validated role. So it's network.backup.run. So this is like the fully qualified name, collection name. So because we have this EE that has all this stuff already in there, it'll be able to point to network.backup.run. And the other thing that it needs to get to the main directory for the validated content is in your Ansible.config file. You can point it there as well. So that way, depending on how you set this up, you may need to like explicitly point to the path. This one will actually find it the way that I set it up in my EE. But just note that there's those parameters too, where you can set the full path to it instead of using the fully qualified name. But this is how I would recommend to set it up such that you can do this, so it's a little bit easier. And then here is where we're saving it. So we're saying our data store is local. So it's local means in the EE, right? So it's in this particular path, and we're going to add this network underscore backup.files that does not exist in our main branch, but it will exist in this branch, whatever we name the branch. So we named it Meetup, May 30th. So that's going to be the name, and then that's where in that branch we will have this folder, and it should have our files. So we publish our changes, and you can see that it's that same module, but instead of get retrieve, it's get publish. And then we have to have these parameters. So retrieve, we don't care because it was just a public repository, so you can just clone it down without the credentials. But to push a change to a repository, then you must have those credentials. So we've got the token and the username and email, so all of that is populated. And that was, again, where that comes from is the credential that I showed you in the automation controller. So it was using a token, but we just called it password. So as we move down, that's what we needed to just push those configurations, into the repo. This is what we needed to manipulate those other job templates so that we could have our intent for the config drift check and also the restore to be able to overwrite, any changes that we make. So before we look at that side of it, let's just go and see our backup files and make sure they're actually there. So if I go back up here, here's all the branches. So this is the master branch. It's called the main branch in GitLab and GitHub, but they still call it master here in Git world. So you'll notice that there is no, there's a network backups, but there's not anything for the files. But if we find our branch that we created, so this is the one that we did, Meetup May 30th, and then it added the timestamp to it. And we scroll down, we can see that 11 minutes ago, so I blabbed on for 11 minutes. Wow. We see that we added those files in here. So here's router 1. And then it should be like the native format for each one of those. So router 3 is the one that looks the most different because it's Junos, right? So it's JSON by default. And Arista looks just like Cisco. It's a little bit different. But we have all these backups there and available. So they live there. And then what we did is we updated, when we ran that, it updated these other 2 templates. So if I go back to Git, and if I run the restore, and I'm going to go ahead and launch it, but not really let it run. I think I can stop it. See how we're here? So it updated our option there. So that's the only reason why we updated it, so we could update our available branches that we have to select. So I'm going to go ahead and pop out of this. So the second thing I wanted to do was make a change. So we did a backup, and then in this router 1, and one of the things that the change is going to do is change the way that the tunnels are configured and do some other stuff like that. I think it's tunnel 1. Yeah, there's no description on here. So it's kind of current state is what we have here. And there's also BGP. Right, we have this BGP config. When we make the change, the BGP is removed and OSPF is modified, and that tunnel will have a description. So we can kind of use those as checkpoints to make sure that things actually change and change back. So if I go back to here, I want to run a different template. And this one's the topology one that I showed you on the slide, or the topology change. All right, so we'll run this. And then this self-service, I can pretty much leave everything alone. My defaults, I do have like a drop down just to show you that there could be, options to set this for somebody to consume a playbook, but not really need to know anything about the playbook. So we're just kind of front-ending information here. So I'll leave those alone, but I'll change the description. right? And then when I hit next, you'll notice that all of that gets converted to variables, right? So these are the equivalent of extra variables that would override anything else that was set, for those variables somewhere else, because there's a precedence, for variables. There's like 21 different locations where you can set variables, but extra variables would be the ones that would sit at the top of there that would, override anything else below that. The lower ones are things like defaults in roles and stuff like that. You can have variables in your inventory, group, or host bars. Outside of your inventory, you can have those as well, and you can have variables in your playbook, in your task. There's a you know 21 different places that you can add variables, and this is one of those. So this should change the config a little bit. So basically, I'm changing my lab around. And since it did the Cisco one while we're still here, so BGP is gone. And then we have a description now on tunnel one. And then the rest of it should be done by now. Yeah. So we changed the config on all of those other ones. So at this point, what we would expect to see is, like, if this was a mistake or something, then I'd be able to actually override the device configuration. And what's nice about this particular method is we don't have to do a lot of playbook configuration. It's really just telling it what devices and where the backups are. It will override the startup, which forces the running to change, which avoids like any problems with the running config. Because sometimes the running config, it's more like a merge. So if you've ever done that before, where you're trying to like copy your startup to running, it'll complain, depending on like the config that was in your startup versus like having configs of the similar things in it and running but different, and it'll complain about that. So there's a force option that it will go ahead and it will override no matter what, which means you don't have to reboot the box. So these types of restorals are easier to deal with. Like a long time ago, you used to have to actually reload the box in some cases. So it makes it a lot cleaner. So let's go back to our Git. And then we're going to do the restore. And I'll show you the playbook for restore. I think we just looked at the backup one. So why this runs. So we are this one. And we'll go ahead and restore all three of those. Stop that for a second. So while that runs, let me pop back in here. Or yeah, restore. And you'll see it's kind of the same thing. The group variable here is what we in the beginning of the self-service survey is asking us, which groups. So that this time we're using whatever we select, because we don't have to restore it to everything, so we can just pick which groups we want. And then as we go into the task, now we're asking for the branch name. So that's a variable that we've already established in the self-service survey. So we pick which branch, and then from that we're pulling down that specific branch. Right, so only that branch. We don't care about any other branch than the one that we selected. And then in the restore, that's what it's using. Is it's going to, run the network.restore.run role, and it's going to do its thing based off of our variables. And one of the variables is the data store. So this is where we want it to find that particular backup file. So inventory underscore host name is a magic variable, like one of the included variables that will look at whatever host it is in a particular group. And then in our case, it'll be router 1, router 2, router 3, router 4. It will find each one of those, and then that's what's being pushed, to the device. And they're all, again, they were in here. So I go back this. So it's going to push these configs back, which was before we made those changes. So right here, everything's done. If I filter changed, then you can see that we retrieved the repository, and yeah, we got these ones down here. So we go through and we have to use that um, SCP, so that we can get it to the device, and then it's overriding the startup config, right? And then that restores the config, to the running config. So this is just like popping in here where you can see, here's the destination where it's going to go on the flash memory, right? And it's just going to name it this, and then it'll grab that file on the device and go through this to this archive command, and then the final one. And actually, it's actually two final ones. It's a little bit different. Like this is what it looks like on Arista, and this is what it looked like on the Cisco. And then router 3, we didn't have to go through that last step because Juniper has commits and commit overwrites, and we've already did that part. So they're a little bit different, depending on the way that the device handles that capability, to change the config. So those are there. So I should be able to go into here, and the tunnel doesn't have the destination anymore, so it's been overridden. And what was the other thing? Yeah, BGP should be back. So that's pretty much it. It's really easy to use. The main thing is that you can, save these into your repo, use those for different environments. You can grab configs that came from production and push them into your lab, for various reasons. So it's pretty useful. It's pretty easy to use. There's not a whole lot of playbook configuration. You just have to learn how to use the source control module and the network.backup and network.restore role. And then these particular playbooks and things are on this public repo, so you can see them, for examples of how to do this. So I'll pop that in here real quick, and I'll add this, like I said earlier, to the Meetup page and all that stuff, and to the description in the YouTube. But if you want it now, I'm going to go ahead and throw that into the chat real quick. So we have a couple minutes left. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Hopefully that was pretty straightforward for those that have been using the controller. I know I didn't go into too much detail into how the control, different aspects of the controller and stuff like that. Was anyone here new to AAP? There's like if you were, there's a little thumbs up emoji. Just trying to see a little bit of a level. It was here. Okay, yeah. So a lot of this stuff, again, um, it takes a little bit of familiarity, but just know that like the capability is pretty easy to do once you grasp, some of the foundational skills. And feel free to look at, I have a ton of other demos on a playlist too on that Ansible4Networking channel that goes through like some more basic stuff. But it doesn't take long to ramp up. Ansible is really easy to learn and very simple to orchestrate kind of complex automation, but making it easy to manage and things like that. So just keep at it, and I'm glad to help anybody get value from it. If especially if you have any questions or anything, you can hit me up on LinkedIn, or from the Meetup too has chat in there as well. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and shut this one down. I hope you have a good config drift. Yeah, thanks for I totally forgot that. All right, so since I have a couple minutes left and I forgot to do that one, my bad. All right, so what we want to do for that one, this just takes a second. Sorry about that. Config drift. All right, so here is that one. All right, so we're running this one right now. So let me try another one because normally I would create a different config. I'm not sure what I had in here. This might be a little bit different. See, we'll compare that one to what's running right now. Anything that's different will show up as a diff. Okay, so there are some things that are different. So I upgraded because I was doing that, a demo of upgrading earlier. So um, the red is what's running in the router right now, 17.7. So if I do a show ver, that's what we'll expect to see there. Yeah, 17.7. And then what else is different here? Of course, yeah, because a lot of the other configs are the same. But if we click in here, we can see a little bit deeper into it and see if there's anything else. Da, da, da. Yeah, I think it's pretty much that was the difference. So I could, let's just do something real quick. So if I just add something in here real quick. Like a new loopback or something. Right, so I got that in there. And then I can just keep the one that we did because that didn't exist, right? So I'll just run it again like this. You can rerun right from here, but it'll take what I've already populated in its self-service. So that way I don't have to keep going back to the very beginning. But when it goes out and checks that device, it should find it. Yeah, right there, see? So those are still different, but then we've got this new description in here. So it picks it up pretty quick. Um, yeah, so there's the other diff. So this is useful if if our standard is whatever we saved in a repo as our single source of truth, and someone makes a change, like any of these changes, we'll be able to see them. And then we could also create like a handler if we wanted to kind of list them out, and then we would be able to go ahead and remediate those. So there's another validated content that I'm not showing today that does have a remediate. So it'll take from the diff, and then it'll go and overwrite the config for just those changes, not the entire config, but just the things that need to change. So that's another one that's like more scoped. But I don't have that one set up in here right at the moment. But that's basically how the diff works for the config drift. And sorry, I forgot about that. It's like, yeah, that same all those playbooks will be in there. Um, if you go into like the main one and then just look for the network backups. So there's a bunch of different demos and things in here. But if you just go to the backup Git section, it'll have that other one. So that is that playbook here, intended. And this one is mine. Like this isn't a part of the intended one like the backup and the restore is a part of that validated role, and then I created this one, so that's why we actually see a different condition depending if you're Cisco, Arista, or Juniper. It's going to handle it a little bit differently, but they're all just checking for diffs, and it's the same thing. We only want that branch, that particular branch that we want to check against. Okay, so now I went over. Sorry about that, but yeah, my apologies. But I'll catch you on the next one. I'm not sure what the topic is, but I'll update that soon. It's always Ansible network automation, and we'll have something else on there, something interesting to walk through and take a look at. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and take care.